The barn smelled different that autumn. Not the familiar scent of hay and motor oil I'd known since childhood, but something wilder, like wet fur and pine resin mixed with earth after rain. I was 16 when I noticed it, home from Seattle to help Grandpa with the property in the Cascade foothills of Washington state. He'd been acting strange since late September, spending hours in the barn after dark, carrying buckets of water and food scraps he claimed were for raccoons. But raccoons don't leave handprints the size of dinner plates on the barn door. It was October 14th, 1987, when everything changed. I remember because it was my mother's birthday, and she'd called that evening, asking if Grandpa seemed okay. "He sounds tired," she said. I told her he was fine, just busy with fall preparations. I didn't tell her about the sounds I'd been hearing at night. Low, rumbling vocalizations that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of my bedroom. Sounds that were neither bear nor elk, but something that made my spine tingle with recognition of something ancient and unknowable. That night, I would learn why some secrets are kept in silence. Grandpa's property sat on 47 acres of mixed forest and meadow, bordered by national forest land on 3 sides. He'd been a wildlife biologist for the Forest Service before retiring, and his small cabin was filled with field guides, research journals, and decades of handwritten observations. He taught me to read tracks in mud, to identify scat and understand territorial patterns, to move through the forest like water through stones, quietly, with respect. Our daily routine that fall followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. We'd wake at dawn, check the perimeter fences, tend to the modest vegetable garden that somehow still produced in the cool mountain air. Grandpa would brew coffee so strong it could strip paint, and we'd sit on the porch watching mist rise from the valley below. He'd point out the resident Roosevelt elk herd, the black-tailed deer that browsed near the tree line, the Cooper's hawks that nested in the Douglas firs. But his attention kept drifting to the barn. The old structure stood about 50 yards from the main cabin, weathered red paint peeling in long strips, roof patched with mismatched shingles from decades of repairs. It housed his ancient Ford truck, gardening equipment, stacks of seasoned firewood, and what he called his collection, specimens he'd gathered over the years. Elk skulls, bear claws, a complete coyote skeleton he'd articulated himself, glass jars of seeds and dried plants labeled in his precise handwriting. I'd been helping him organize the collection when I found the first real evidence. Behind a stack of old National Geographic magazines tucked in a wooden crate were plaster casts of footprints, massive footprints, 18 inches long, clearly showing 5 toes with a distinct arch and ball pattern. The detail was extraordinary. You could see dermal ridges, the texture of skin. "Grandpa," I called out, "what are these?" He appeared in the barn doorway, backlit by afternoon sun, and for a moment I couldn't read his expression. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Old research project," he said, "from before you were born. Are they real? That depends on your definition of real, son." He took the cast from my hands with surprising gentleness, as if it were made of glass. "Found these tracks up near Glacier Peak in 1967. Photographed them, documented everything properly, filed the report with my supervisor. And nothing. Report disappeared. I was told to focus on verifiable wildlife management. And that's bureaucracy for stop looking for things we don't want found." He placed the cast back in the crate, covering it with a tarp. "Some discoveries don't make it into the textbooks." That evening, I noticed Grandpa preparing what looked like medical supplies. Gauze, antiseptic, something that might have been antibiotics from the veterinary supply in town. He packed them in an old canvas backpack along with apples, strips of dried salmon, and a thermos of water. "Taking supplies to someone?" I asked casually. He paused mid-motion, his weathered hands stilling on the backpack strap. In the kerosene lamplight, he preferred it to electric bulbs. His face looked ancient, carved from the same mountain stone as the peaks outside. "In a manner of speaking," he said finally, "there's a situation I'm managing. Can't talk about it yet. Need you to trust me." I nodded, though questions crowded my throat. That night, I lay awake, listening. Around 11 p.m. I heard the barn door creak open, heard Grandpa's voice low and steady, speaking in a tone I'd never heard before. Gentle, almost reverent, the way you'd speak to a frightened animal, or something intelligent enough to understand intention, if not words. Then I heard the response, a vocalization so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. The next morning, Grandpa looked exhausted. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side, and there were fresh scratches on his forearm that he dismissed as blackberry thorns. We worked in relative silence, repairing a section of fence damaged by what he claimed was a fallen branch. But the break pattern was wrong. The wire had been bent outward with tremendous force, and the wooden post had a handprint pressed into the soft grain. Not clawed, not bare, 5 distinct fingers. I said nothing. Some questions demand the right moment. By afternoon, his energy seemed restored, and he suggested I drive into town for supplies. "Take your time," he said, pressing a $50 bill into my hand. More than we needed. "Maybe catch a movie. The new Spielberg film is playing." I understood. He wanted me gone for the evening. I went, but only as far as the logging road turnoff 3 miles down the mountain. I parked the truck behind a stand of cedars and walked back through the forest, approaching the property from the north where the tree line offered cover. The October sun set early in the mountains, and by 6 p.m., darkness gathered beneath the canopy like spilled ink. From my vantage point above the barn, I could see Grandpa emerge from the cabin carrying that same canvas backpack and something else, a heavy wool blanket. He moved with purpose toward the barn, glancing back at the cabin once, twice, as if checking to ensure he was alone. The barn door opened. Warm light spilled out. He'd strung up a camping lantern inside. And then I saw movement. Something large shifting in the shadows. Something that made Grandpa look small by comparison despite his 6-foot frame. I crept closer, each step measured against years of his teachings. Heel first, rolling to toe, breath controlled, become part of the forest. Through a gap in the barn wall where boards had warped apart, I could see inside. There, sitting on a bed of straw and old blankets, was a creature that should not exist. It was massive, easily 7.5 feet tall, even seated, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. Its body was covered in dark reddish-brown hair, long and coarse, matted in places with what looked like dried mud and blood. The face was profoundly disturbing in its almost human quality. A heavy brow ridge, deep-set eyes that caught the lamplight with an amber reflection, a broad, flat nose, and a mouth that seemed capable of both brutal force and subtle expression. But what struck me most was the intelligence in those eyes. Grandpa knelt beside it. Beside him, I somehow knew it was male, and carefully unwrapped the blanket from its left leg. Even from my limited view, I could see the wound, a deep laceration across the thigh, partially healed but inflamed around the edges. A trap injury, maybe, or a confrontation with something sharp. Grandpa worked with steady hands, cleaning the wound with antiseptic, applying fresh gauze with a technique that spoke of experience. The creature watched him with an expression I can only describe as trust. It made low rumbling sounds, almost like a cat's purr but deeper, and when Grandpa spoke, "I know it hurts, friend, just a bit more." Those amber eyes shifted to his face with clear comprehension. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a monster. This was a person of another kind, wounded and vulnerable, putting its life in my grandfather's hands. I stayed frozen behind that barn wall for 2 hours, watching him work, watching him bring food, fish, berries, root vegetables, and offer it with patience as the creature ate slowly, carefully, using its hands with surprising delicacy. I must have made a sound, a shifted foot, a caught breath, because suddenly those amber eyes locked onto my position. The creature's entire body went rigid, muscles tensing beneath the fur, and it released a sound that can only be described as a warning, a low, guttural vocalization that I felt in my chest cavity. Grandpa turned sharply. "Daniel," not a question, a statement heavy with resignation. I stepped into the lantern light, hands visible, palms open. I'd learned that much from watching him. "I'm sorry. I needed to know." The creature watched me with an intensity that was almost unbearable. This close, I could see the details that no grainy photograph or plaster cast could capture, the subtle expressions that flickered across its face, the way its breathing pattern changed with emotional state, the complex structure of its hands, palms dark like old leather, fingernails thick but shaped, capable of both power and precision. "Easy," Grandpa said softly, though I wasn't sure if he was speaking to me or to his patient. "Daniel is family. Safe." He kept his movements slow, deliberate, positioning himself between us not as a barrier but as a bridge. The creature's eyes moved between us, assessing. Then gradually, the tension eased from its shoulders. It made a softer sound, questioning. "This is what you've been hiding," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "How long?" 3 weeks. Found him caught in an old bear trap up on the ridge. Illegal trap. Abandoned years ago. Grandpa's voice was tight with controlled anger. By the time I found him, the infection had set in. He was dying. We should call someone, Fish and Wildlife or— And what? Grandpa interrupted. Turn him over to federal authorities who'll either deny he exists or lock him in a facility somewhere? Make him a specimen? He shook his head. I didn't spend 40 years studying wildlife management to betray the trust of the most remarkable living being I've ever encountered. I looked at the creature, at him, and saw understanding in those eyes. He knew we were discussing his fate. He knew he was vulnerable. And there was something else there, a profound weariness, as if hiding and running and simply surviving had become its own kind of wound. Is he the only one? I asked. I don't know. In 40 years, I've found evidence of maybe 3 individuals in this region. They're incredibly sparse, incredibly careful. This one, Grandpa gestured toward his patient, made a mistake, came down from higher elevation, maybe displaced by the logging operations to the north, maybe just hungry, stepped wrong. The creature shifted slightly, wincing as his injured leg moved. Up close, I could see how thin he'd become. Ribs visible beneath the fur, the muscle mass diminished from what must have been an already massive frame. What's his name? The question surprised me as I asked it. Grandpa smiled faintly. I don't presume to name what I don't own, but I call him Old Man because of the silver around his muzzle. He's ancient by my estimation, maybe 50, 60 years old if their lifespan is similar to ours. Old Man watched us both, and then did something that changed everything I thought I understood about the world. He reached out slowly, carefully, and touched Grandpa's shoulder with one massive hand, a gesture of thanks, a gesture of connection, a gesture that proved intelligence, empathy, and something that could only be called friendship. The 3 of us sat in that barn for another hour, while Grandpa explained everything. He spoke in low tones, sometimes directing his words to me, sometimes to Old Man, who listened with focused attention that was startling in its humanity. The tracks from 1967 had been just the beginning. Over the decades, Grandpa had documented 17 separate encounters, always at a distance, always respectful of boundaries. He'd recorded vocalizations, collected hair samples, photographed temporary structures made of broken branches. He'd mapped movement patterns, identified preferred food sources, and developed a working theory about territorial ranges that suggested a population of perhaps 10 to 15 individuals spread across the entire Cascade Range. They're remnants, he said, running a hand through his white hair, like the mountain gorillas or orangutans, great apes on the edge of extinction, smart enough to hide but running out of places to hide in. The logging operations, the recreational development, the constant human encroachment, they're being squeezed into smaller and smaller fragments of wilderness. But if people knew, I argued, if the scientific community accepted they were real, wouldn't there be protections? Endangered species status? Grandpa's laugh was bitter. You think that's how it works? Daniel, the moment proof surfaces, this becomes the biggest story in history. Media circus. Hunters wanting trophies. Scientists wanting specimens. Government agencies wanting control. Every yahoo with a camera and a dream of fame crashing through these forests. He gestured to Old Man. They're not animals to be tagged and tracked. They're not monsters to be feared. They're people. Different people, but people nonetheless. And they've chosen to remain hidden for a reason. Old Man made a soft sound, almost like agreement. His hand moved to his injured leg, touching the bandage with surprising gentleness. So what do we do? I asked. We can't keep him in the barn forever. No, Grandpa agreed. The wound is healing well. Another week, maybe 2, and he'll be strong enough to travel. There's a section of roadless wilderness about 30 miles north near the Canadian border. Old growth, remote, protected. If I can get him there, he'll have a chance. You mean if we can get him there? I corrected. Grandpa looked at me for a long moment. This isn't your burden to carry. You're 73 years old with a bad hip. You're not driving 30 miles into roadless wilderness alone with an injured Sasquatch. The word felt strange on my tongue, too tabloid sensational for the reality sitting before us. Besides, I'm already part of this now. What I didn't say aloud was the conflict tearing through me. Part of me, the part raised on scientific method and empirical evidence, wanted to document everything. To take photographs, to collect samples, to be the person who proved to the world that they existed. It would change everything. My name would be in textbooks. But another part, the part that had learned from Grandpa how to read the forest and respect its inhabitants, understood that some knowledge carries responsibility heavier than fame. Looking at Old Man, at the trust in his eyes, the vulnerability of his situation, I knew that choosing documentation would be a betrayal not just of him, but of something essential about what it meant to be human. We couldn't be both witness and guardian. We had to choose. 2 weeks, I said finally. We keep him safe for 2 weeks, get him healed, and get him home. Grandpa nodded slowly. Old man's eyes moved between us, and though he couldn't speak our language, I believed he understood the contract we'd just made. Over the following days, I fell into the rhythm of care. Grandpa took morning shifts while I kept up appearances around the property. Afternoons, I'd spend hours in the barn, initially under the pretense of organizing equipment, but increasingly just sitting, observing, learning. Old man communicated in ways that transcended language. His vocalizations ranged from low rumbles of contentment to sharp warning barks to something almost like laughter, a huffing sound he made when Grandpa told stories about his younger days in the Forest Service. He understood tone, context, intention. When I moved too quickly, he'd tense. When I sat still and quiet, he'd relax, sometimes moving closer to investigate the books I brought to read. His hands fascinated me. They were powerful enough to snap branches thick as my wrist, yet delicate enough to pick individual berries from a cluster without crushing them. He ate with care, never wasteful, and he drank water by cupping his palms, a gesture so profoundly civilized it made my chest ache. The wound was healing remarkably well. Grandpa's veterinary training served us well, and whatever old man's physiology was, it responded to antibiotics and antiseptic care. By day 5, the inflammation had reduced significantly. By day 8, he was putting weight on the leg. But it was on day 9 that I understood the true depth of what we'd undertaken. I was alone in the barn at dusk, reading by lantern light while old man rested when I heard sounds from the forest. Distant but distinct. Vocalizations, similar to old man's, but different in pitch and pattern. He heard them too, immediately alert, his entire body oriented toward the sound. He moved to the barn door, placing one massive hand against the wood, and responded. A complex series of calls, low rumbles, higher whoops, something like a questioning tone. The forest answered. Old man turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw something that nearly broke me. Longing, profound, desperate longing. He was calling to his people, and they were calling back. They're looking for you, I said quietly. Your family. He made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and touched his injured leg. Then he gestured to himself, to the barn, to his leg again. Even with his people so close, he knew he wasn't strong enough yet. Leaving now meant becoming vulnerable in the wilderness, unable to keep up, unable to defend himself. I made a decision then that I had no authority to make. I opened the barn door wide. Go to them, I said. Call them here. Old man looked at me with something approaching shock, then understanding. He moved to the doorway silhouetted against the darkening forest and called out. Long, carrying vocalizations that echoed through the valley. The response came closer and closer. From the tree line, perhaps 50 yards distant, 2 figures emerged. Smaller than old man, but still massive, moving with fluid grace through the undergrowth. They stopped at the forest edge, clearly visible in the fading light. A female and a juvenile, I guessed, both watching the barn with obvious caution. Old man called again, gentler this time, and made gestures I didn't understand. Complex hand movements that looked almost like signing. They didn't approach closer, but they didn't leave either. They were there, waiting, keeping vigil for one of their own. And I understood then what we were really doing. We weren't just healing an individual. We were preserving a family, a culture, perhaps even a species hanging by a thread. The complication arrived on day 12 in the form of Sheriff Tom Briggs and a ranger from the Forest Service named Patterson. They pulled up to the cabin in a county vehicle just before noon, while I was splitting firewood, and Grandpa was allegedly in town for supplies, actually in the barn administering what we hoped would be the final round of antibiotics. Daniel, right? Sheriff Briggs was in his 50s with the comfortable belly of someone who spent more time doing paperwork than chasing criminals. Is your grandfather around? Went to town for supplies. I lied smoothly. Should be back in an hour or so. Mind if we wait? Patterson asked. He was younger, early 30s, with the lean build and sharp eyes of someone who actually spent time in the wilderness. His gaze moved across the property with professional assessment. Sure, I'll make coffee. Inside the cabin, I could see the barn through the kitchen window. No movement. Grandpa was smart enough to stay hidden when vehicles approached. We'd established protocols. But I also knew Old Man's family was still out there, maintaining their vigil, and any investigation of the property could lead to disaster. We've had some reports, Sheriff Briggs began, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. Hikers hearing strange sounds, claims of seeing large animals. One fellow insists he saw something walking up right near your property line. My stomach dropped, but I kept my expression neutral. Probably bears. They stand up sometimes. That's what I told him, Briggs said amiably. But Patterson here has concerns about unlicensed wildlife rehabilitation. Your grandfather has a history of, let's call it, independent wildlife management. Patterson leaned forward. We received an anonymous tip that someone matching your grandfather's description was seen purchasing large quantities of medical supplies and food in town, enough to suggest he might be keeping something substantial on the property without proper permits. He's preparing for winter, I said. He's always stocked up this time of year. Mind if we look around? It wasn't really a question. They had authority, and refusing would only create suspicion. Sure, I said, my mind racing. But Grandpa's particular about people moving his equipment. Maybe wait until he gets back? Won't take long, Patterson said, already standing. Just a quick perimeter check. We walked the property, and I steered them away from the barn through every excuse I could manufacture, showing them the repaired fence line, the vegetable garden, the woodshed that needed organizing. But Patterson's attention kept drifting to the barn. What's he keep in there? Truck, tools, collected specimens from his career. It's basically a museum of 40 years in wildlife biology. Specimens, skulls, preserved plants, his research notes. He's meticulous about documentation. Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly. I'd like to see that. We were 10 yards from the barn door when Grandpa's truck came rumbling up the drive, arriving with perfectly suspicious timing. He climbed out slowly, taking in the official vehicle. The three of us, the trajectory we were walking. Sheriff, he greeted calmly. Something I can help you with? What followed was a careful dance of misdirection, legal technicalities, and Grandpa's decades of experience dealing with bureaucracy. He showed them permits for wildlife collection from his working years, explained his supply purchases as routine preparation, and casually mentioned his standing as a respected former Forest Service biologist. But Patterson wasn't satisfied. Sir, I'd like to inspect your barn. You have a warrant? Grandpa asked mildly. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. I don't need a warrant for a wellness check on potentially distressed wildlife, Patterson replied, his hand already on the barn door handle. Grandpa's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten. There's nothing in there but equipment and old research materials. Then you won't mind if I verify that. The door swung open before either of us could respond. The barn was empty. Not just empty of Old Man, empty of any evidence he'd ever been there. The straw bedding we'd arranged, the blankets, the medical supplies, even the scattered food remnants, all gone. Only Grandpa's legitimate equipment remained, neatly organized, and the collection specimens displayed exactly as he'd described. Patterson walked through slowly, methodically checking every corner, every shadow. He examined the truck, the shelves, even the loft space. Nothing. Satisfied? Grandpa asked. Patterson frowned, clearly frustrated. The tip was very specific. Tips often are, Grandpa replied. Doesn't make them accurate. Probably someone who saw me buying supplies and let their imagination run wild. You know how people love their Bigfoot stories in these parts. The word hung in the air, acknowledged, dismissed, rendered harmless through casual mention. Sheriff Briggs chuckled uncomfortably. Well, everything seems in order. Sorry for the inconvenience, folks. He shot Patterson a look that said they'd be having words later about wild goose chases. After they left, Grandpa and I stood in the empty barn without speaking for a long moment. Then he walked to the back wall and pressed a specific knot in the wood paneling. A section of the wall swung inward, a false wall I'd never known existed. Behind it was a root cellar, cool and dark, with Old Man sitting perfectly still in the shadows. His eyes gleamed in the lantern light as Grandpa brought it closer. They're gone, Grandpa said softly, but they'll be watching now. We need to move tonight. Old Man nodded, an unmistakably human gesture, and stood carefully, testing his leg. The movement was still cautious, but strong, healed enough. We waited until 2 a.m. Under a moonless sky, we loaded Grandpa's truck with camping gear that disguised our true cargo in the covered bed. Old Man folded himself into the space with difficulty but determination. and we covered him with tarps and equipment. The drive north took 4 hours on logging roads and fire breaks, traveling without headlights where possible, navigating by Grandpa's intimate knowledge of the terrain. When we reached the designated spot, a roadless wilderness area so remote that even the trails were decades overgrown, we helped Old Man from the truck. He stood in the pre-dawn darkness, breathing in the scent of ancient forest, and something in his posture changed. This was home, real home. From the forest came answering calls. His family had followed, maintaining contact throughout his captivity, waiting for his return. Old Man turned to us, first to Grandpa, placing one massive hand on his shoulder in a gesture of profound gratitude, then to me. He held my gaze for a long moment, and I understood we were being seen, truly seen, by an intelligence as valid and real as our own. Then he made a sound, complex, melodic, almost like speech, and we understood it was goodbye. He moved into the forest with increasing confidence, and within moments, 3 figures merged in the shadows. Old Man, the female, the juvenile, a family reunited. They paused once at the tree line, silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky, and then they were gone. We never saw them again. The drive back was silent, both of us processing what we'd done and what it meant. By the time we reached the property, sunrise was painting the Cascades in shades of gold and pink, and the world looked exactly as it had before, but we were different. Patterson came by twice more over the following weeks, clearly unconvinced by the empty barn, but without evidence or warrant his hands were tied. The anonymous tip was eventually attributed to a local with a history of Bigfoot enthusiasm and attention-seeking behavior. The case, such as it was, closed. Life returned to routine. I went back to Seattle for school. Grandpa continued his quiet existence in the mountains. We never spoke directly about Old Man, but sometimes on phone calls, he'd mention hearing interesting vocalizations during his evening walks, or finding tracks that showed promising biodiversity recovery. I understood the code. Years later, after Grandpa passed away at 87, I inherited the property. Among his papers, I found journals documenting everything: dates, observations, photographs of the healing process, detailed notes on behavior and communication. But the final entry was just a single line: some knowledge is meant to be lived, not published. The greatest discovery of my life will remain the best-kept secret, because that's what love looks like, knowing when to stay silent. I burned those journals in the fireplace one by one, watching decades of irreplaceable documentation turn to ash. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most important, because I've continued Grandpa's work in my own way. I became a conservation biologist focusing on habitat preservation in the Pacific Northwest. I advocate for roadless wilderness areas, for wildlife corridors, for the protection of old-growth forests. I never mention why these wild spaces matter so profoundly to me, but I fight for them with everything I have. And sometimes, late at night in the forests of the Cascades, I hear vocalizations that make my heart skip, complex calls echoing through the valleys, impossible to attribute to any known species. I don't investigate. I don't document. I just listen, and I'm grateful. The barn still stands on the property, weathered and leaning slightly now. I keep it maintained, though I rarely use it. But on the back wall in the hidden root cellar behind the false panel, I've left something: a small wooden box containing the plaster cast of a footprint, a tuft of reddish-brown hair, and a photograph of Grandpa standing in the forest, his hand raised in greeting to someone just outside the frame. Evidence that will never see publication. Proof that will never convince skeptics. Truth that serves a greater purpose by remaining hidden. My daughter asks sometimes about the strange sounds she hears when we visit the property, about the massive tracks we occasionally find near the tree line. I tell her what Grandpa told me. The forest has its own stories, and sometimes the greatest privilege is being trusted to hear them without needing to share them with the world. There are still places where mystery lives, where the impossible breathes and moves beneath ancient canopies, where beings older than our history walk in silence, surviving by remaining unseen. And the real miracle, the thing that makes us human in the best sense, is learning to protect that mystery instead of exploiting it.